Picture this. You're walking home from work, hungry with only one sandwich left. But then you see a dog, a stray, cold and starving, looking up at you with pleading eyes. You've only got one meal. What would you do? This is Jason's story, a young man who gave his last bite to a hungry dog, and what happened next changed everything. Jason wasn't living a life of luxury. In fact, his days were a constant grind. A small town, a rundown apartment, and a part-time job at a gas station were all he had. Making ends meet was a struggle, and there were days when he barely had enough to get by. But one evening, as he walked home with his last sandwich in hand, something happened that would change his life forever. He crossed paths with a stray dog. Skinny, dirty, and starving. The dog's eyes were filled with desperation, and in that moment, Jason had to decide: keep the sandwich for himself or offer it to the dog who needed it more. It wasn't just about food. It was about compassion, humanity, and an unexpected connection that neither of them could have predicted. This is the story of that moment and everything that followed. He wasn't even sure why he'd ended up back in this town. His dreams of a better life had fizzled out when he realized just how hard it was to break free. At the time, it seemed easier to return to the place where he had roots, where people knew him by name, even if they barely noticed him now. Jason lived in a tiny, run-down apartment, barely enough space for a bed and a few worn-out pieces of furniture. The walls creaked with every step he took, and the heat barely worked in the winter. Some days he wondered why he even bothered trying to keep going. Jason had always dreamed of something bigger than the small town he was born in. Growing up, he imagined a life in a city, full of lights, opportunities, and adventure. But at 22, he found himself right back where he started, stuck in a small town that felt more like a forgotten corner of the world than a place where dreams came true. The idea of small-town life had seemed charming back when he was younger, but now, after a few years of trying to make a living, it felt more like a trap. Life was a constant cycle of waking up, working, and repeating. Each day bled into the next, a blur of monotonous tasks and days that felt too long but also too short. Jason's job at the local gas station, tucked on the edge of town, was as unremarkable as it sounded. The once bustling stop for gas and snacks now sat mostly empty, a relic of a past era, the kind of place that only still existed because no one bothered to shut it down. His days were filled with customers who came in and out without ever saying much. Occasionally, someone would stop to chat, but the conversations were always about the weather or who had moved away, never anything deeper. Jason was good at filling gas tanks, wiping down counters, and ringing up snacks, but those weren't the things that made him feel alive. Those were just distractions, necessary chores that kept him busy while the world outside seemed to move on without him. When his shift ended, the air was already cooling down. The sun was sinking behind the horizon, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. Jason's feet ached from standing all day, and his stomach reminded him that it hadn't had enough to eat. He was tired, exhausted, really, but it was a familiar exhaustion, the kind that only made him feel like he was getting through life, not actually living it. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and started the long walk home. The quiet streets of the small town stretched out before him, empty except for the occasional car passing by. The night air was crisp, the kind of chill that always seemed to creep under your skin, no matter how many layers you wore. Jason pulled his jacket tighter around himself and kept walking, the familiar path home seeming like it would go on forever. As he walked, he couldn't help but think about the life he had envisioned, the city life, a job that actually paid enough to get by, a place to call his own, a life where he could actually do something with himself. He had always believed that the world was bigger than this small town, but now, as the miles of empty streets stretched before him, he wondered if he'd made a mistake. Maybe he was just stuck here forever, caught in a loop of endless days that all felt the same. He didn't even care. The only thing that made him feel like he mattered at all was his routine. Wake up early, go to work, eat whatever food he could afford, go home, rinse and repeat. His social life was practically non-existent, save for the few people at work who would stop and say hello, but that was about as much human interaction as he got. Jason had gotten used to being alone. It had become the norm. But one thing Jason never quite got used to was hunger. There were days when food was a luxury. He wasn't starving, but he wasn't eating like he should either. Most days he made do with whatever he could scrounge up. That evening, for example, he'd picked up a sandwich before his shift, a simple turkey and cheese on wheat bread. Nothing special, but enough to get him through. It wasn't a meal that would fill him up for long, but it would get him through the day. Jason wrapped the sandwich carefully in a napkin and stuck it in his backpack, planning on eating it once his shift was over. He couldn't afford to eat anything else, not if he wanted to make it through the rest of the week. His rent was due, bills piled up, and there was always something else that took precedence over food. Now why he was thinking about it. Maybe it was the cold evening air, or maybe it was just the weight of the day finally getting to him. Whatever it was a familiar feeling, being stuck, waiting for something, anything, to change. As Jason passed the old alley that led to the woods, he noticed a movement out of the corner of his eye. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of movement in the fading light. But then he saw it more clearly. A small, scruffy dog emerging from the shadows. At first, Jason thought it might just be another stray, one of the many dogs abandoned in this town. People often left their pets behind when they moved, and those animals rarely lasted long. But this dog, something about it stopped him in his tracks. It wasn't like the others. It wasn't barking or running around. It was slow, its steps shaky, and its fur was matted and dirty. The dog's ribs were visible beneath its thin coat, and its body looked like it hadn't had a decent meal in days. But what really stopped Jason in his tracks were the eyes. The dog's eyes were wide, almost pleading, like it was trying to communicate something, the kind of look you couldn't ignore. For a moment, neither of them moved. Jason stood there, looking at the dog, and the dog seemed to do the same, sizing him up, deciding whether or not he was safe. Jason's heart ached at the sight of the dog. It wasn't just hungry. It looked desperate, like it had been abandoned, with no hope of ever finding someone who would help. Jason shifted the weight of his backpack on his shoulder, his hand instinctively going to the sandwich inside. It was the only food he had left, the only thing that could get him through the night. But there was something about the dog's stare that made him feel like he couldn't just walk away. For the first time in a long time, Jason didn't feel just tired or hungry. He felt something else, something that hadn't surfaced in him for a while. Compassion. It wasn't even a decision at first. It was more of a reaction, an instinct to do something. The dog took another hesitant step forward, its tail wagging weakly. It was hungry. Jason could see it. And for a moment he thought about keeping the sandwich. He thought about how he was barely scraping by and how food was a luxury. But then he looked at the dog again. The hunger in its eyes was undeniable. This wasn't just an animal looking for food. It was a creature in need, a creature that had nowhere else to turn. Jason's stomach growled loudly, reminding him of his own hunger. But as he looked down at the dog, his own needs seemed to shrink. This dog needed the sandwich more than he did. He took a deep breath and pulled the sandwich from his backpack. The bread was a little soggy, but it was still food. He carefully tore off a piece and crouched down in front of the dog. He held it out, watching as the dog sniffed it hesitantly, then took it from his hand. It didn't waste any time, devouring the bread in seconds. Jason stayed quiet, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe the dog would run off after it ate, or maybe it would just look up at him with a quick "thank you" and disappear into the night. But that didn't happen. Instead, the dog sat down in front of him, wagging its tail weakly. It stayed there, eyes locked on Jason's, like it was waiting for something. For a second, everything around them felt still, as if the world had paused. Jason could feel the weight of the moment, something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't alone anymore. In that quiet, dimming light, Jason realized something simple but profound. This wasn't just about a sandwich. It wasn't about hunger. It was about connection, about being seen and understood. The dog didn't have words, but it offered something more than that. Trust. Jason smiled softly, something warm stirring inside him. He reached into his bag and pulled out the last piece of bread, breaking it off and holding it out. The dog eagerly took it from his hand, licking his fingers afterward in a silent show of gratitude. And as Jason watched it eat, something inside him shifted. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like he was just surviving. He felt like he mattered, that this moment, this small act of kindness, meant something. And as he looked into the dog's eyes, he knew one thing for sure. This moment, this act of giving, was going to change everything. The night deepened, the shadows growing longer, and the chill in the air creeping through the seams of Jason's jacket. He stood still for a moment, watching the stray dog curl up at his feet, its body trembling from more than just the cold. Jason had made the decision without thinking twice. He couldn't just walk away from this creature. The small act of kindness, giving the last bit of his sandwich to the dog, had felt like a lifeline, an unexpected connection in an otherwise isolated world. But now, with the wind picking up and the temperature dropping further, Jason realized he couldn't leave the dog out here to face the night alone. The dog had settled against him, its thin, ragged coat pressed against his legs as if seeking whatever warmth Jason could offer. It looked up at him with those wide, trusting eyes. Jason felt a twinge of guilt as the dog's head sank back to the cold pavement. It had no place to call home. It had no one to care for it. Jason's thoughts shifted. The dog needed more than just food. It needed shelter, warmth, and most of all, someone to watch over it. He glanced at the small, run-down apartment he'd been living in for the last year. It was cramped and lacked basic comforts, but it was home. The idea of bringing a dog into that space seemed impossible. There was barely enough room for him, let alone a dog. But as he stood there, watching the dog press closer to him for warmth, he knew he couldn't just leave it. Not now. Not like this. This was the moment he would have to make another decision. One that could change everything. Jason stood up slowly, trying not to disturb the dog. The cold wind bit into his skin as he shifted his backpack. The dog stirred but didn't move. He crouched down beside it, gently speaking in soft tones. "Hey, buddy, you're coming with me," he murmured, mostly to himself, but the words seemed to settle into the space between them. The dog lifted its head, its eyes still searching Jason's face, as if understanding the importance of the moment. It let out a soft whine and shakily got to its feet. Jason extended his hand, and the dog, albeit hesitantly, nudged its head into his palm. The briefest moment of connection, but it was enough. It was clear the dog had no other choice but to follow him, just as Jason had no choice but to try. "Come on," Jason said again, more firmly this time, as he stood up and began walking toward the street. The wind howled against him, but he hardly noticed. He was focused on the little dog behind him, and that was all that mattered now. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the streets eerily silent as Jason and the dog made their way down the darkened road. The wind bit at his exposed skin, but Jason couldn't help but glance down at the dog every few moments, making sure it was still following. The dog stumbled now and then, its legs weak, but it always picked itself back up, determined to keep going. It wasn't long before they reached his apartment complex, a small building nestled at the end of a dimly lit street. Jason's heart skipped a beat as he looked up at the familiar run-down facade. The windows were cracked in places, the paint peeling, but to him it was a place of familiarity, a place that he could call his own. For the first time tonight, he found himself wishing it could be more. Jason hurried up the stairs, clutching the dog's collar gently in case it tried to run. The dog had begun limping, its gait uneven and weak, but it kept moving, driven by the same instinct that had brought it this far. Jason unlocked his door and pushed it open, the stale air from inside washing over him like a reminder of everything he had come to accept. It wasn't much, it was barely a home, but right now it was all he had, and it would have to be enough. The dog hesitated at the threshold, looking up at Jason as if wondering whether it should step into the unknown. Jason squatted down, offering the most comforting smile he could muster. "It's okay, buddy. You're safe now." The dog's tail wagged slowly, cautiously, before it took a step inside, its paws clicking softly on the floor. Jason shut the door behind them and dropped his bag on the couch. He quickly grabbed an old blanket from his bed, spreading it out on the floor. The dog sniffed at it before lying down, its body still shaking. Jason moved quickly, grabbing a bowl from the kitchen and filling it with water. He set it down in front of the dog, watching as the dog sniffed at it. But it didn't drink. Not yet. The dog seemed exhausted, its body stiff, its movements slow and lethargic. Jason sat down next to the dog, gently running his fingers through its matted fur. The animal flinched slightly, but didn't move away. He could feel the dog's bones beneath its skin, the thinness that suggested it hadn't eaten in days. This wasn't just a stray. This was a creature in desperate need of care. It wasn't just food it needed, but love, comfort, the kind of things Jason wasn't sure he had enough of himself to give. But something inside him stirred, a feeling he hadn't had in a long time: responsibility. He reached over to the small counter and grabbed what little food he had left, some canned beans and a few pieces of stale bread. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Jason heated the beans on the stove, then brought the bowl back to the dog, setting it gently in front of it. This time, the dog sniffed the food. For a moment, it just stared at the bowl, unsure. But then, as if it had no more energy to question whether it could trust Jason, the dog began to eat. It devoured the beans so quickly, so hungrily, that Jason had to resist the urge to take a step back. It was like the dog had been starving for weeks, even though Jason couldn't be sure of how long it had actually been on its own. Jason watched quietly, feeling a sense of responsibility settle deeper into his bones. He hadn't planned for this. He hadn't planned for any of it. But the more he watched the dog eat, the more he realized that this was exactly where he was supposed to be. He was meant to care for this creature, to give it what he could, no matter how little that might be. The dog finished the last bite and sat back, its breathing more relaxed now. It still shivered slightly, but Jason could see the difference in its eyes. There was something in them now. Life. Not the desperate, scared look it had earlier, but something else. Relief. Trust. Jason stayed on the floor next to the dog, gently stroking its fur. The warmth of the small space, the quiet companionship, was something Jason hadn't realized he needed. For the first time in months, he didn't feel completely alone. He didn't feel like he was just going through the motions of surviving. He felt like he was part of something. The night stretched on, the wind howling outside, but inside there was a different kind of stillness, a peace that Jason hadn't known he'd been missing. And as he leaned back against the couch, closing his eyes for just a moment, he listened to the quiet, steady breathing of the dog beside him. Eventually, Jason drifted into a restless sleep, but not one of fear or anxiety. Instead, it was a sleep that came from knowing he had done something right. For once, he felt like he was where he needed to be. The morning light filtered in through the cracks in the curtains, and Jason woke to find the dog still curled up on the blanket, its breathing deep and even. It had been a long night, but they had made it. Jason stretched, feeling stiff from sleeping on the couch, but he didn't mind. He had shared his space with something that needed him, something that, in some way, had given him purpose. As he stood up and moved to the kitchen, he realized that it was more than just feeding the dog or offering shelter. It was the connection, the simple, unspoken bond between two creatures who had both been lost. One wandering the streets in search of food and shelter, and the other lost in the motions of life, searching for something meaningful. And now, in that small apartment, they had both found it. Jason made a simple breakfast, the last scraps of food he had left. As he turned around, he found the dog sniffing the air, its ears perking up as it moved toward him. Jason smiled softly. "Good morning, buddy," he whispered. "We made it through the night." The dog wagged its tail, a little more enthusiastically this time, and Jason felt a warmth fill his chest. Whatever came next, whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. And in that moment, he realized that the bond between them wasn't just about giving. It was about finding something that made life worth living. It wasn't about rescuing a stray dog. It was about rescuing himself, too. 3 weeks had passed since Jason had taken Buddy in. At first, it was supposed to be a temporary arrangement, just long enough for the dog to recover. But as each day slipped by, it became clear that Buddy wasn't going anywhere, and neither was Jason. What began as a simple act of kindness had transformed into something more, a bond that Jason didn't know he needed, but couldn't imagine living without. Buddy had become family. The days followed a simple routine. Wake up, feed Buddy, walk him, go to work at the gas station, and come home. The walks had started small, just around the block, but as Buddy's strength returned, they ventured further. They became a ritual for both of them, a time to clear their heads and explore the world around them. Jason was still uncertain about many things in his life, but Buddy gave him a sense of purpose, a reason to move forward. One crisp autumn morning, something felt different. The air had an edge to it, colder than usual, with the kind of chill that spoke of winter on the horizon. Jason pulled his hoodie tighter around his body as Buddy trotted ahead of him, nose to the ground, sniffing intently. Jason had a lot on his mind: work, bills, groceries. But Buddy's sudden change in behavior caught his attention. "Hey, slow down, Bud," Jason called, noticing Buddy was darting ahead faster than usual. "What is it, boy?" "It's a man." Buddy's tail was wagging furiously as he pressed his nose deeper into the grass. Jason jogged to catch up, expecting Buddy to be chasing after a squirrel or maybe a piece of trash. But when he reached Buddy, he stopped in his tracks. The dog wasn't chasing anything at all. He was sniffing the ground. But what he had found wasn't something Jason recognized. It was a trail. A narrow, barely noticeable break in the underbrush led deeper into the woods. It wasn't a hiking trail, just a slight indentation in the grass and leaves, the kind of thing animals might use to pass through. But Buddy was locked in on it, tail still wagging in sharp, quick bursts, his body stiff with purpose. Jason frowned. He had walked this path 100 times before. He knew these woods. There hadn't been any trails here, not like this. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as a faint unease crept through him. "Buddy, what are you doing, man?" Jason asked, tugging on the leash. But Buddy didn't budge. Instead, he barked once, sharply, then looked back at Jason with those deep, knowing eyes. Jason swallowed. "You really want to go down there?" Buddy's response was another bark, more insistent now. Jason's eyebrows furrowed, and he glanced down the trail, his unease growing. It didn't look dangerous, not at first glance, just a narrow path into the woods. But something about it felt off. He looked back at Buddy, who was now staring at him, waiting. Jason hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "All right, fine, let's check it out." They followed the path deeper into the woods. The further they went, the quieter it became. The sounds of the distant highway, the cars, the bustle of the neighborhood, all of it faded into a heavy silence. Only the rustling of the wind in the trees and the crunch of their footsteps on the dry leaves filled the air. It was the kind of quiet that made Jason feel like the world outside the woods didn't exist anymore. Jason glanced over his shoulder, suddenly feeling exposed. "Should have brought my phone," he muttered. But it was too late now. The trees had closed in behind them, and for the first time, Jason felt like they were a world apart from the place he knew. Buddy's pace had quickened, his nose working overtime as he trotted ahead. Jason kept his eyes on the dog, but the odd stillness in the air gnawed at him. He glanced around, wishing he could shake the sense of unease. The path wound left and right through the woods, curving in a way that made it feel almost deliberate. It didn't feel like a random animal trail anymore. Jason was about to suggest they turn back when something caught his eye, a glint of light. Metal. Jason squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. A flash of sunlight reflected off something, barely visible through the trees. He stepped forward, heart beginning to race as his mind processed what he was looking at. It was a fence, a tall metal fence, at least 10 feet high, with sharp barbed wire curling around the top. It wasn't just any fence. It was industrial-grade, heavy-duty, the kind you'd see around a secure facility, not in the middle of the woods. Jason's stomach churned. "Buddy, come here," Jason called out, crouching down to look at the base of the fence. There were no signs, no markings, no logos to indicate who might own it. The metal felt cold and solid beneath his fingertips, as though it had only just been put up. His gut told him to turn back, to walk away and pretend they hadn't seen anything. But Buddy wasn't listening. The dog was still locked on something beyond the fence, his whole body tense. Jason's unease deepened. "What is it, Buddy?" he whispered. Before Jason could react, Buddy barked again, this time more urgently, his tail stiff. Jason glanced at the dog, then back at the fence. Something wasn't right. He looked through the gaps in the wire, trying to make sense of what was on the other side. At first, he saw nothing. Just trees. But then, something moved. It was subtle, but it was there. A flash of white behind the trees. Jason's heart skipped a beat. The camera, mounted on a tree, aimed directly at them. Its lens glinted in the sunlight, locking onto them with a cold, mechanical precision. Jason froze. "Okay, yeah, we're done," he muttered, yanking on Buddy's leash. "Nope, not today. Let's go." But Buddy didn't move. Instead, the dog stood still, ears flattened, body tense, staring straight ahead. Jason tugged on the leash again, harder this time, but Buddy was locked onto something. Something beyond the fence. "Oh, Buddy, come on," Jason snapped, feeling the tension in the air rise. His heart was thumping in his chest now, his instincts screaming at him to leave before things got worse. But before he could react, there was movement. A figure emerged from behind the trees. It wasn't a person, not at first glance. But it was a dog, a bigger, stronger dog. Its coat was snow white, almost too clean to be a stray. Its eyes were sharp, focused, locked on to Jason and Buddy with an unsettling intensity. Jason's pulse quickened, his mind racing. This wasn't a stray. This wasn't just a dog. It was a guard dog. Before Jason could react further, he heard it. The low hum of an engine, a drone. The sound was faint at first, but it grew louder, and Jason's stomach dropped. "Not good," he muttered, his gaze snapping toward the trees where the sound was coming from, and then it appeared. A sleek, black drone, hovering silently about 20 feet in the air. Its camera lens was trained on them, and it circled them slowly, methodically, as if observing, studying. Jason's heart pounded. "Okay, we're out," he said, his voice tight with fear. But Buddy didn't budge. Jason glanced down at the dog. Buddy was still staring up at the drone, his body frozen, eyes locked on it. Jason tugged on the leash again. "Buddy, come on." His voice broke as panic surged in his chest, but Buddy didn't move. The drone hovered in place for a moment before turning and flying deeper into the woods, disappearing from sight. Jason didn't wait another second. He grabbed Buddy's leash and started running, his feet pounding against the dry leaves, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His pulse was a drumbeat in his ears as he tried to force himself to think rationally. Who had drones out here? Why was there a camera in the trees? And that dog? What was it guarding? His mind raced as he pushed through the trees, trying to get back to the road. He glanced behind him, half expecting someone to follow them, but there was nothing. Just the sound of their own footsteps crunching through the leaves. When they finally broke through the trees and emerged onto the open road, Jason collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. His body felt like it was on fire, every nerve on edge. Buddy sat down beside him, looking up at him with his usual calm expression. His tail wagged softly, as if nothing unusual had just happened. Jason rubbed his face, trying to steady his breathing. He looked back toward the woods, but all was silent. No drones, no guard dogs, no cameras. But Jason's gut told him that whatever he had stumbled onto today wasn't over. It had only just begun. "What did we just find, huh?" Jason asked Buddy, his voice shaky. "And why do I feel like we're gonna be back there real soon?" Buddy licked his hand, his tail thumping against the ground as if in agreement. Jason sighed. He glanced back toward the woods. Something told him they weren't done with this mystery. Not by a long shot. It had been almost a week since Jason had stumbled across the hidden research facility deep in the woods. The strange dog, the drone, the cameras, everything about that day had left him unsettled. The unsettling feeling had lingered in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried to ignore it, he couldn't shake the conviction that there was something more to uncover, something bigger. Jason had spent the days following his discovery, trying to piece things together. Who was behind the facility? Why were there drones and guard dogs? What were they hiding? But no matter how many times he went over the events, the answers eluded him. There was only one way forward. Go back. He needed to know what was going on. He couldn't just leave it hanging. Buddy, as always, was his constant companion. Over the past few weeks, their bond had only grown stronger. Jason wasn't sure who needed who more, he who had been alone for so long, or Buddy, who had found a safe haven in him. But they were inseparable now, and this next step was something they'd take together. Jason packed a small bag for the trip: water, snacks, a flashlight, and his old phone, which hadn't been turned on since that fateful day. He also included a notebook, a habit from his younger days when he used to keep a journal about everything. There was no way he'd leave without documenting whatever he found. He wasn't going into the woods unprepared this time. When they reached the fence again, Jason stopped. The metal gates, tall and unyielding, loomed before him like some great, silent sentinel. But this time, there was a palpable sense of expectation in the air. The facility wasn't just a structure. It was waiting for them. Jason felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He wasn't sure if it was fear or something else, but his pulse quickened. For a brief moment, he questioned if he should turn back. This was dangerous. But there was no turning back now, not after everything he had seen, everything he had felt. "Let's go, buddy," Jason whispered. He crouched down next to the fence, carefully scanning the perimeter. The metal was cold, smooth, and unmarked, but as he ran his fingers along the bars, he felt something. Something small, a crack, a slight gap between two sections of the fence. He hesitated for a moment, then slid his phone out of his pocket, turning on the flashlight. The light illuminated the small opening, just wide enough for him to slip through. "You ready, boy?" he whispered to Buddy. The morning air had a crisp bite to it, autumn fully taking hold of the forest around him. As the sun slowly climbed over the horizon, casting long shadows across the ground, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him. He didn't know what, but it was like the trees themselves were holding their breath. Buddy trotted ahead as if he was already on a mission. Jason followed closely behind, his mind racing with questions. The closer they got to the woods, the stronger the strange, almost unnatural quiet became. It wasn't just the isolation of the forest. It was something else, something that felt off, something that whispered of secrets, of things hidden beneath the surface. Buddy Everloyal gave a soft bark, his tail wagging as he crouched next to Jason. Without a second thought, Jason crawled through the gap, holding his breath as he slipped to the other side. Buddy followed without hesitation, his paws clicking lightly against the ground as he squeezed through. Once on the other side, Jason straightened up and took a deep breath. The air felt different here. It was quieter, cleaner, almost sterile, but not in a bad way, in a way that felt purposeful, like the space had been designed to foster a sense of peace, of something higher. The silence was thick with meaning, and Jason felt a rush of anticipation. They moved deeper into the woods, keeping low to the ground, just as they had before. The further they went, the more the forest seemed to open up, the trees thinning out as a strange clearing appeared ahead. But this wasn't a natural clearing. It was too perfect. The ground was level, the edges of the clearing almost deliberate, as if someone had planned for this space to exist. Jason's eyes widened in disbelief. Ahead of them, nestled in the center of the clearing, was a hidden compound, an entire network of interconnected structures. The buildings weren't large or imposing, but they were designed to blend seamlessly into the natural environment. They were made from sustainable materials, with green roofs, solar panels, and wind turbines visible in the distance. The architecture was clean, functional, and unobtrusive, carefully planned to coexist with the surrounding nature. Jason's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just some random research facility. It was something far more sophisticated, far more intentional. Buddy's bark interrupted Jason's reverie and he snapped back to the present. He'd wandered too close to the perimeter of the compound. There was no telling who might be watching, and if anyone saw him, he would be in serious trouble. But as Jason slowly backed away, he froze. A group of wolves were pacing along the edges of the compound, their coats gleaming in the sunlight. They were white, just like the mysterious dog Jason had seen before. Their movements were graceful, their bodies strong and healthy. They were free to roam around, unhindered as if they belonged here. There was no sign of captivity. No cages, no chains, no fencing to restrict them. Buddy watched the wolves from a safe distance, his posture calm, almost understanding. Jason crouched down beside him, his breath caught in his throat. The wolves didn't appear to be afraid or aggressive. In fact, they seemed peaceful, content. It was as if they knew they were part of something important, something bigger than themselves. As Jason observed them, the wolves began to move toward a small building at the center of the compound. A simple structure with large glass windows. It didn't look like much at first glance, but Jason knew better now. Inside, he saw two figures, human figures, standing by a large screen. They were focused on something, watching it with a look of quiet intensity. Jason crept closer, staying hidden behind the trees, peeking through the glass. His curiosity was almost unbearable, but he knew he had to be careful. The monitors inside were displaying real-time footage of the wolves. But it wasn't just about tracking their movements. No, the technology was far more advanced than that. Graphs and numbers streamed across the screens, but Jason could make out one thing. The system was tracking the wolves' behavior in real time, measuring their interactions with each other, their emotional states, their decision-making processes. Jason's mind raced as he watched the screen. This wasn't just wildlife research. It was something much, much more. Buddy barked again, snapping Jason out of his daze. He froze, crouching low, praying the people inside hadn't heard. The wolves, too, turned their heads in their direction, their ears twitching as if they had sensed something. Jason held his breath. The man inside the building turned toward the window, his eyes scanning the trees for a brief moment. Jason shrank back, praying he wouldn't be seen. The seconds felt like hours. But then, the man turned back to the screen, and Jason let out a silent sigh of relief. The woman beside him spoke. "You know, we're really close now," she said, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "The wolves are adapting well to the technology. Soon we'll be able to work with them directly. It's almost like they understand what we're trying to do. This project, it's going to change everything." Jason's pulse quickened. "What we're trying to do?" The man nodded, his gaze still fixed on the screen. "It's more than just tracking. We're trying to understand their cognitive behavior, how they process information, how they make decisions. This is the future of conservation, not just protecting these animals, but working with them, learning from them, and helping them thrive in the modern world." Imagine the possibilities. Jason's heart raced as he processed what he was hearing. This wasn't just about studying animals, it was about partnering with them, working alongside them, learning from them. The possibilities were vast, far beyond what Jason had ever imagined. But as the woman continued speaking, another thought wormed its way into Jason's mind. How far would they go? Buddy whimpered softly beside him, sensing Jason's anxiety. Jason looked down at the dog, his mind reeling from the implications of what he had just overheard. This project, this place, it was everything he had been searching for, and more. A new kind of conservation, where humans and animals work together for a greater good. But Jason couldn't help but wonder, what would the world think when it found out? How far were they willing to push the boundaries of cooperation? And would it ever be enough? Jason took one last look at the facility, his mind spinning with the weight of it all. There was no turning back now. He had found something far bigger than himself, something that could change the world. But was he ready to be a part of it? One thing was certain, there was no going back now. Jason and Buddy stood silently in the shadow of the research facility, the weight of their discovery heavy in the air between them. The wolves had disappeared into the trees, their sleek forms vanishing into the wilderness as if they had never been there. But Jason knew better. What they had witnessed was real. The hidden technology, the human effort to protect and understand these animals, the way the wolves had moved freely, yet in harmony with something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It had all left a mark on him. For what felt like an eternity, Jason stood there, rooted to the spot. His mind raced as he tried to process everything. How had he gone from a curious, somewhat naive boy who barely understood wildlife conservation to someone who had stumbled upon something so monumental? What did it mean for the future of the animals, the environment, and, perhaps more importantly, for him? Buddy, ever the loyal companion, nudged his hand with his nose, pulling him out of his reverie. Jason looked down into the dog's eyes, seeing in them a quiet understanding, a reflection of his own swirling thoughts. There was no turning back now. "Come on, Buddy," Jason murmured, his voice soft but resolute. He gave the dog a gentle pat on the head, then turned to walk away from the facility. They began retracing their steps back through the woods, heading toward the clearing where Jason had first slipped through the fence. But as they moved through the forest, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The trees seemed to whisper with the wind, as if they too had become aware of the shift that had just occurred. The air felt lighter, as if the world had just taken a deep breath, preparing itself for the next chapter in its story. Jason had spent the past few days grappling with the knowledge he had uncovered. What had begun as a series of curious questions about a mysterious research facility had now evolved into a deeper understanding. He now saw the bigger picture. What was happening in those woods wasn't just about protecting endangered animals. It was about creating a sustainable relationship between humans and nature, one that acknowledged the intelligence of animals and allowed for a shared future. This project was not merely about observing and documenting wildlife. It was about partnership. The wolves, the dogs, even the bears. They were no longer subjects of study. They were co-partners in a vision for the future, one where humans and animals could coexist and thrive together. As they walked deeper into the woods, Jason paused, listening to the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. It was in this moment that the full weight of what he had uncovered hit him. The future of conservation was never going to be the same again. It wasn't enough to simply create nature reserves, plant trees, and hope for the best. The real solution, Jason now understood, was collaboration. Learning from the natural world, understanding that the survival of both human and animal species was intertwined, and working toward a common goal. He thought back to the research staff, the woman who had spoken about adapting technology to work with the animals, and the man who had discussed the cognitive abilities of the wolves. They weren't just scientists, they were pioneers, crafting a new path toward a world where human intervention wasn't about control, but about mutual respect and shared stewardship. Jason's mind wandered back to the conversation they had had. They had spoken about the future, a future where technology, data, and animal intelligence could be harnessed not to exploit the environment, but to help it thrive. For the first time, Jason began to see conservation in a new light. Wildlife wasn't something to control, to confine, or to merely admire. It was something to understand and support, and that was the core of the project he had uncovered. A new way forward, a way where humans and animals would work together to heal and protect the planet. But even as the weight of this realization sank in, another thought gnawed at him. What would happen when the world found out? Jason had seen the potential for something much greater than he had imagined. The technology, when fully realized, could help protect the planet, save endangered species, and bring about a level of understanding between humans and animals that had never existed before. But there was always the risk of exploitation. What if corporate interests got involved? What if government saw this as a tool for control rather than preservation? He couldn't shake the image of the wolves he had seen earlier, free and wild, yet part of something larger. They were not merely animals under study. They were collaborators in a new vision for the future, a future that balanced technology with the natural world. But he knew all too well that balance could be fragile. Once the secrets of this research were made public, everything could change, either for better or for worse. Jason exhaled deeply, watching the swirling autumn leaves around him, feeling the weight of the decisions ahead. He had so many questions, so many uncertainties, but one thing was clear. This story, this mission, was far from over. Jason didn't realize how far they had walked until the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees, casting soft golden light over the forest floor. The day was breaking, and for the first time in days, Jason felt the weight of his thoughts begin to lift. It was a beautiful morning, a new day. He said, as they reached the edge of the forest, Jason stopped and turned to look back at the towering trees. Their branches swayed gently in the breeze, and for a moment, Jason felt a sense of connection to the land that he hadn't expected. It was as if the forest, the animals, and even the research facility had accepted him. The wilderness had become a part of him. It wasn't just the wolves, the bears, or the incredible facility that had shaped this new understanding. It was something deeper, something fundamental. A realization that the natural world was resilient, beautiful, and full of potential, and it was worth fighting for. Jason knew his journey wasn't over. He couldn't walk away from what he had discovered. The world needed to know. He had to share the message of this new way forward, a message that the earth and its creatures weren't just something to study or admire from afar, but were living, breathing beings that had intelligence, emotions, and needs. And the future of the planet depended on how humans learned to respect them and work alongside them. Just as Jason felt his resolve harden, his phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. He pulled it out and saw a message from his friend Sarah, who had been helping him with his research into wildlife conservation. "Hey Jason, I've been doing some digging. You won't believe what I found. This could be the key to everything we've been working on. Call me when you get a chance. I need to talk to you about this. Urgent." Jason stared at the message for a moment, feeling a surge of urgency rise in his chest. This was it. The next step in his journey, the next chapter in a story that was far from over. This wasn't just about a hidden research facility or even about the wolves. It was about the future. It was about ensuring that the next generation would live in harmony with nature, not separate from it. As he reread Sarah's message, Jason knew there was no turning back now. He could feel the gravity of the situation settling on him. This was no longer just an adventure or a mystery. It was a calling. Jason turned to Buddy, who was sitting quietly by his side, his loyal eyes watching him intently. The dog had been with him every step of the way, and Jason could feel the bond between them growing stronger with each passing moment. "Well, Buddy," Jason said softly, his voice steady with newfound determination, "I guess we've got work to do." With a deep breath, Jason looked toward the horizon. He had a mission now, one that would take him far beyond the woods and the research facility. It was time to change the world. The forest behind them seemed to hum with energy, as if agreeing with Jason's decision. The wind rustled through the trees, the birds overhead sang their early morning songs, and the world felt alive with possibility. It was like the world was waiting, just as Jason was, waiting for someone to step forward, to make the difficult choices, and to fight for something greater than themselves. As Jason and Buddy began walking toward the horizon, the sun rose higher, casting a golden light over everything. It was a new day, a new chance, and Jason knew that whatever came next, he would face it head on. Because the future of conservation wasn't just about protecting what we had. It was about building something better, something sustainable, something shared. And Jason was ready to be part of that change. If you believe in a future where humans and animals can coexist and thrive together, share this story, spread the word about the groundbreaking work happening right now, and help create a world where nature isn't something to conquer, it's something to protect, to nurture, and to work alongside. Together, we can make a difference.